Hello, my name is Madeline Rady. I'm in my second year at Middle Georgia State University. Here I will be presenting my oral presentation for my world literature class taught by Professor Fuller. My oral presentation is on the life and works of the modernist poet T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot, fondly known as T.S. Eliot, was the most important poet of his time. Many have said that T.S. Eliot pioneered modern poetry and took the world by storm with his words. He also wrote many dramas, which even furthered his fame in the literary world. T.S. Eliot was born September 26, 1988, and died at the age of 75 on January 4th, 1965. His legacy continues to live on today, as people all around the world still read and try to comprehend the brilliant poetry and dramas from such a brilliant mind. Eliot's poetry paved new thoughts as he questioned the ideals of the human mind, including many poems written out of his spiritual beliefs and convictions. T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri, to a New England family. Eliot went on to attend Harvard and later Sorbonne, and then Oxford in England, where, because of the war, he would be confined for a time. Eliot was extremely intelligent, and he was a master of the human psyche. Eliot thus took opportunity of his extended stay in England and became a schoolmaster, a bank clerk, and later a publisher for Faber and Faber. Eliot was also a husband to Valerie Eliot, who he married in 1950 and later divorced in 1932. Eliot was also a husband to Vivian, who he married in 1957 and then stayed married till his death in 1965. Vivian was also a writer who was plagued by many health problems that troubled her. Nevertheless, Vivian's life greatly influenced Eliot's writings and works since the beginning of their marriage. It is there in England where Eliot resided and later became a British citizen. That is why, today, both England and the United States split claim to the famed poet and his works. Eliot did much editorial work at Faber and Faber, which later catapulted him to write some of his most famous works. Some writers' most famous works come out of complete insanity, and for T.S. Eliot, that rung true. T.S. Eliot composed many poems, but one, if not his most famous poem, The Wasteland, was composed when Eliot was confined to a sanatorium in Switzerland after a major breakdown. His breakdown resulted after the war, and some believe it to be linked with issues with his wife at the time. The Wasteland, released in 1922, wasn't Eliot's only popular piece of literature, though. Eliot went on to write poems such as Murder in the Cathedral, The Family Reunion, The Cocktail Party, The Four Quarters, and The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Many of Eliot's later works dealt with his spiritual thoughts and ideals after Eliot joined the Anglican Church in 1927. 1927 was a big year in the life of T.S. Eliot. It was this year that Eliot joined the Anglican Church and also joined the country of England through citizenship. For T.S. Eliot, joining the Anglican Church after being raised American Unitarian stirred much thought in his heart. Because of his new religion, Eliot became conservative and anti-Semitic. It is ironic, though, that his beliefs were so conservative, but that his literary work was drastically changing modern literature as we know it today. Even though his poems had much to do with religion, Eliot never wanted to be conceived as a religious poet. That is why his former poem, The Wasteland, is seen as a serious look into the alienation of people after World War I. It dealt with the need for redemption in a lustful and greedy world. Even then, it can still be seen as having a religious backing, but any piece of literature can be seen as that as well. With all this talent must come a role model for T.S. Eliot. And for Eliot, that role model was Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was also an American poet and critic who later resided in England just like Eliot. Pound was extremely influential in the life and works of T.S. Eliot. When writing Wasteland, Eliot even started the poem with a quote by Ezra Pound, who he coined as the better craftsman. Pound even had a big hand in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This poem seemed to be extremely successful for Eliot, which later furthered him to write his first book entitled Prufrock and Other Observations in 1917. Prufrock is now fondly known as the most loved poem of its time. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock provides the reader with food for thought. Eliot was one of the best poets at being able to make you sympathize with the character while all at once catching on to wit that plagued Eliot's works. The poem starts out with these words from Dante's Inferno. It is translated and says so. If I thought my answer were to one who could ever return to the world, this flame should shake no more. But since if what I hear be true, none did ever return above from this depth, without fear of infamy, I answer thee. This is a poem of a man's agony who feels useless and unheard by the world around him. The character is also dreading marriage in its entirety. Throughout this poem, you see Eliot's use of poetry tools such as tone, sing-song speech, coherence, and symbolism. It is ironic that while the character is worried about being overlooked, the poem was anything but that. The Wasteland, on the other hand, signifies all that Eliot was about. It addressed cultural and spiritual issues, which is what most of Eliot's writing after further expanded on. As stated earlier, this poem hits on the alienation of people after the war, and also Eliot's cry for what he feels a need for redemption. It is a story of a king in search for the Holy Grail. The king is wounded and in need of a healer. Throughout the poem, Eliot uses allusions, the Holy Grail being a Christian allusion. It is alluding to the needs of the king's land and its need for redemption from its waste and despair. Eliot said this about his thoughts of world despair. I found no discipline in humanism, only a little intellectual discipline from a little study of philosophy. But the difficult discipline is the discipline and training of emotion. This is the world has great need of, so great need that it hardly understands what the world means. And this, I have found, is only attainable through dogmatic religion. Only those have the right to talk of discipline who have looked into the abyss. Through these symbols in the wasteland, Eliot perfectly role-plays and tries to convey his thoughts for the needs of his world around him. It was through poems such as The Love Story of J. Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland that Eliot was able to leave his mark on world literature. It was through his success that T.S. Eliot would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1945, which is no small feat, but for Eliot it was inevitable. Eliot went on to write and even more dabbled in writing dramas. His dramas were also renowned, and even till his death, Eliot continued to prove himself in the literary world, with producing more popular modernist works. Through his writings and drama, Eliot gained 2 Tonys, which spread his name and fame even further. Through his writings, Eliot shaped the way modern literary writers write today. Eliot's use of physiological and spiritual ideas led Eliot to become the famous writer he was. Eliot described himself in few words, and it couldn't be a truer statement. Classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. And he was right. He was all those things and more. He molded poetry from not just a feeling to an aesthetic object. And for that, we are extremely grateful for the works and mind of Thomas stern Eliot.